It started on a rainy Thursday in downtown Seattle. I was sitting in a leather chair that squeaked every time I moved. The air in the lawyer's office smelled like old books and expensive wood. I wore a black dress, my heels still damp from the sidewalk outside. I hadn't fully processed that my father was gone. The funeral was just 2 days ago, and I still felt like I hadn't breathed since. Across the table sat my younger brother Mason, legs stretched out, arm casually slung over the chair. He was dressed like he was going to brunch, not a will reading. My mother sat next to him, silent, her eyes fixed on the wall behind me like I wasn't even there. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. To my son Mason, I leave $9 million, all property, and controlling shares of the family trust. He paused. And to my daughter Ava. My heart froze. My fingers curled into the fabric of my dress. I waited for the words. Nothing. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. Just nothing. I felt my breath catch. I turned to my mother, expecting some kind of mistake. But she didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. Cold, calm, and done. You always said you wanted to make your own way, she said flatly. Go do that. That was it. No hug. No goodbye. Just a dismissal. Like I was a stranger. Like the years I spent helping my father build his company, the late nights organizing his books, the weekends I spent missing out on college parties to work in his office. None of it mattered. I looked at Mason. He didn't say a word. Didn't look at me. Just smirked slightly like he had already won something. I tried to smile. My lips moved, but nothing real came out. I nodded, stood, and walked out of the office without saying another word. But as I stepped into the hallway and the door clicked shut behind me, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt sharp, focused. Something inside me shifted. Something broke, yes, but something also lit up. Because I knew this wasn't just some final wish of an old man. This wasn't about me earning my own way. This was planned. They wanted me out. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The silence in the house was louder than ever. I stayed in my father's study that night, the one room no one had touched since the funeral. The air still smelled like his cologne, woodsy and sharp, fading into dust. I sat at his old desk, brushing my fingers across the scratched surface, and stared at the drawer on the right, the one he always kept locked. Growing up, this room felt sacred. No one entered unless invited. Now I was inside alone, the only light coming from the desk lamp that buzzed faintly. I opened the drawers one by one, flipping through papers, receipts, and handwritten notes. But something felt wrong. There were no documents with my name. No emails, no letters, no photos. Not one picture of me on the shelf, even though I remembered a photo of us on the pier sitting right by the window. It was gone. In its place now, Mason, holding a trophy I won. I pulled out an old binder labeled Annual Reports. It was for the community fundraiser we started when I was in high school. I remembered spending entire weekends planning it with my dad. But inside the binder, all the credits listed Mason. Mason's name was on every event. The donor letters were signed by him, like I'd never been involved. I moved to the file cabinet. Folder after folder, I found projects I worked on, all rewritten. My parts missing. My name deleted. It wasn't just absence. It was erasure. I sat back, stunned, and remembered something. It was 2 years ago. Late at night. I had stopped by his office unannounced. My father had been working late. I walked in quietly, and he didn't hear me right away. He was writing something. A letter maybe. When he saw me, he looked startled. Not scared, more like wary. If anything ever happens, he said quietly, don't trust the surface. At the time, I thought he was just tired. Maybe talking about business, maybe about Mason. But now, those words came back like a warning left too late. I stared at that locked drawer again. The key, I knew, had to be somewhere. He never trusted digital locks. He believed in old-school privacy. Somewhere, maybe hidden in a book's spine or taped under a drawer, the key waited. But I didn't find it that night. Instead, I found the gap, the absence, the precise, surgical way I had been removed from the record. Not ignored, removed. It was like watching someone else take credit for your entire life, and no one noticing. That night, I didn't sleep. Because if they'd gone this far to erase me, they must have known I might start looking. And they weren't finished. The test arrived in a plain envelope, smaller than expected. I had ordered it in a moment of desperation, trying to understand why my mother had always treated me like I didn't belong. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe grief was distorting everything. But once I saw the results, I sat perfectly still, staring at the paper like it might rewrite itself if I blinked too long. It didn't. My mother wasn't my biological mother. The words were clear. A full panel. No relation. Not a shred of shared DNA. I read it again. Again. Then once more. I wanted it to be a mistake. I wanted someone to blame for the wrong file, the wrong sample. But it was mine. My name. My birth date. The truth. And then I understood. All of it. Her coldness. Her clipped words. Her refusal to show affection, even when I was a child desperate for it. The way she looked through me like I was furniture, and not her daughter. I wasn't hers. I never had been. And suddenly, her parting words at the will reading echoed differently. You always said you wanted to make your own way. That wasn't disappointment. That was rejection. That was her letting me go without ever saying goodbye. I tore through the house, the study, the attic, looking for anything, any clue. My father had loved me. That part one knew. But now it all felt like a lie wrapped in a secret. I ended up in the hallway closet, sitting on the floor, surrounded by old photo albums. I flipped through them, barely breathing. There, near the back, tucked inside the last page of a dusty leather album, was a folded piece of paper. A letter in my father's handwriting. Ava, if you're reading this, you've started to see it. I never meant for the truth to hurt you, but I had to protect you from what she would do if she knew how much of this was meant for you. Go to my first office, the one before we moved downtown. What you need is there. The real ledger, not the public one. I sat back on my heels, the letter shaking in my hands. He knew. He knew what she was capable of, and he tried to hide me from it. All this time I thought they had just passed me over, that I was unworthy, forgotten, not strong enough. But this wasn't neglect. It was sabotage. Deliberate. Planned. Because I wasn't her daughter. And she never intended to let me take any part of the legacy she thought belonged to her bloodline. I wasn't erased because I failed. I was erased because I never fit the blood map she cared about. But now I had the letter. And the next step. The ledger waited. And so did the truth. The old warehouse office hadn't been touched in years. It sat on the edge of the city, wrapped in rust and silence. The kind of place people drove past without ever wondering what was inside. My father never talked about this location after we moved to the new tower downtown. He said the business had grown, outgrown its roots. But he never sold it, never cleared it out. That alone told me everything. I came at night. No cameras. Just a bolt cutter and a flashlight. The lock snapped off easier than expected. The air inside was thick with dust, stale and dry, like the whole place had been holding its breath. I stepped over fallen filing cabinets, cracked picture frames, and years of forgotten plans. It didn't take long to find the back wall. He had always been clever with hiding places. When I was little, he used to build puzzles out of wood just for fun. Every drawer had a trick, every lid a secret. I tapped on the paneling and heard the hollow thud. One piece of the wall shifted slightly. I pried at the edge with a screwdriver until it popped open. Behind it was a metal lockbox covered in grime. Inside, a journal. It was worn, its corners curled, the leather frayed. Inside, the pages were filled with names, some I recognized from boardrooms and banquets. Others I didn't. But the deeper I read, the colder my hands became. Shell companies, offshore accounts. Funds moved quietly through charities, fake projects, fake employees. Property bought under aliases, then transferred again. Everything tied to the family business, but off the books. There were notations in the margins. Too risky. Push back 2 quarters. Cover with expansion announcement. And then I found it. My name. Page after page listed roles I remembered working in. Project manager. Events coordinator. Financial analyst. All positions I'd filled in real time. But next to each one, my name had been crossed out. Slashed through with a red pen, replaced with Mason's name. It wasn't just my contributions that had been erased. They had been stolen. Even the roles I fought for, the ones I stayed late to finish, were reassigned after the fact, as if I had never existed. I turned the last few pages and found entries from my father himself. Handwritten. His tone shifted. Less business, more fear. One line stuck with me. They've changed everything. I tried to keep her out of it. She's the only one who didn't lose her soul. He wasn't protecting the company from, he was protecting me from what they had turned it into. This wasn't the empire he built with pride. This was something darker, rotting from the inside out. And now it had a name, a ledger full of shadows, and I was going to drag it into the light. The hall glittered like a palace. Crystal chandeliers, gold trim, a red carpet rolled out over marble. My father's face smiled down from massive banners draped across the ballroom. In loving memory, Richard Halston, visionary leader, father. It was grotesque. Everyone here wore the same mask. The same fake grief stretched across their faces like porcelain, cracking only when the wine refilled and the cameras turned away. I stood near the back wall in a black satin gown, dark bobbed wig, and smoky makeup. My name for the night was Elise Carrington. No one blinked. In this world, money made memory shallow. If you looked like you belonged, you did. A waiter passed with champagne. I declined. I needed my mind sharp. At every table, deals were being whispered behind framed pictures of my father. Property portfolios. Restructuring. Overseas interests. I recorded it all, a tiny device tucked in my clutch. My mother stood at the head table in a silver dress, expression as smooth as ever. Mason flanked her, nodding, grinning, owning the room like he hadn't erased his own sister from every corner of it. What made my stomach twist wasn't just the lies. It was how easy they made it look. How natural. As I moved past a group of CEOs to the edge of the terrace, a man in his 60s caught my arm gently. Graying hair, tailored suit. His eyes narrowed as he studied me. "You look like him," he said. I froze. "I'm sorry. Richard." "You've got his eyes." His way of holding tension in your shoulders. He offered a sad smile. "He didn't want this for you. He tried to keep you away from all of this." My voice stayed low. "And what is all of this exactly?" He didn't answer right away. Just nodded toward the crowd. "Deals disguised as philanthropy. Investments built on disappearances. They dragged you in when they realized you could be a threat." He took a sip of his drink. "But they'll regret that." I stayed composed, accepted a glass from a passing server. My fingers trembled slightly, but I masked it with a polite sip. My father's world wasn't simply built on ambition. It had been twisted into a carnival of deception. This was never about legacy. It was about laundering darkness in daylight. Every compliment, every handshake, they were rehearsed, poisoned gifts. And I wasn't here to mourn anymore. I was here to listen, to gather, to remember every mask and every name. Because the cracks were showing. And when the time came, I would shatter all of it. The documents were tucked away in an old filing cabinet, buried beneath decades of tax records and outdated contracts. They smelled like dust and ink, paper worn thin by time. I found them inside my father's private archive, something even the current staff didn't know existed. I had followed a trail of numbers from the ledger, numbers that led to a sealed vault in the basement of the law firm that once handled our family's financials. The trust agreement was older than I expected, handwritten in parts, annotated with my father's tidy cursive. As I read through the original terms, my heart started to pound. I was meant to inherit the estate. It was spelled out clearly. My father had outlined the company's future with precision, noting my role in each branch, detailing how the assets would shift over time, how Mason would receive a fixed sum and step away. It made sense. I had built alongside him. Mason never wanted the responsibility. He wasn't built for it. But as I flipped to the newer version, dated just 2 months before my father died, the entire structure had changed. Now, Mason had full ownership, full authority. I was mentioned once, briefly, as a non-controlling beneficiary, which translated to nothing. Something didn't sit right. I compared the documents line by line. The language felt off, colder, technical. And then I noticed the notary's seal. It was the same name that had appeared in a past scandal, a name I remembered from a real estate deal Mason nearly tanked years ago. That deal had involved a fake witness, a forged approval. My father had covered it up quietly, furious behind closed doors. And now here that same notary was again, somehow certifying a trust amendment worth millions, signed just weeks before my father's unexpected death. I dug deeper, running the seal number through a verification system. It didn't match any active notary on file. The stamp was fake. The signature traced. A forgery. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was theft. He hadn't won some cruel game of parental favoritism. He had stolen the entire estate with a pen and a lie. I sat there for a long time, trust papers spread out across the floor, the air around me suddenly too still. The silence felt heavy, like something had been waiting for me to uncover this. There was no mistake. My father didn't change his mind. He didn't rewrite the future. Someone else did. And now that I had proof, it was no longer just about reclaiming what I lost. It was about exposing what they did. Because I wasn't buried by failure. I was buried by a forged trust. And they were going to choke on their own signatures. The more I dug, the more the threads pulled tighter. What began with forged documents had turned into something far uglier, something deliberate. I wasn't just erased from the trust. My father had been erased from life. I spent days cross-referencing legal records, access logs, archived files no one thought anyone would ever look at again. My background in digital forensics, the thing they mocked me for studying instead of law or finance, finally became a weapon. I followed metadata trails, server timestamps, encrypted file names left just slightly unguarded. One night, past midnight, I cracked into a backup drive once tied to my father's personal legal team. Hidden behind a series of corrupted folders, I found them, emails. Exchanges between my mother and an offshore firm based in the Cayman Islands. Phrases jumped out like knives. Should be finalized before any complications arise. Ensure medical discretion. No visible irregularities. My blood ran cold. Complications. Medical discretion. No irregularities. That was no business discussion. I pulled the strings harder. The coroner's report had been sealed. Unusual, even for someone of my father's stature. Publicly, they said cardiac arrest. Quiet, quick, clean. But my father had no history of heart trouble. He took his health seriously. He had regular checkups, a clean record. I needed answers. Real ones. I went to the county medical examiner's office, posing as a law intern researching sealed cases. The clerk was young, nervous, easy to read. A A few $100s slid across the desk bought me access to a redacted autopsy file. Most of it was standard, but something was missing. The tox panel. It hadn't been filed. The date was there, the form was generated, but the results were never scanned into the system. Someone had removed it. I pressed harder. I found a technician who had been on shift that night. An older woman with tired eyes. She hesitated when I asked about the autopsy. When I showed her the missing file, she stiffened. She didn't confirm anything. She didn't deny it either. I asked if anything unusual had been noted, anything overlooked. She paused, then pulled out an old printed scan from her private folder. I kept this, she whispered. Didn't feel right at the time. It was a photo from the autopsy table. On my father's upper thigh, barely visible, a tiny bruise, a needle mark, not mentioned in the official report. I stared at the image for what felt like hours. He hadn't just died. He'd been silenced. All those years trying to keep me safe, to shield me from what the business had become. And in the end, they took him out like a liability. Now it wasn't just my inheritance they stole. It was his life, and I wasn't in their web anymore. I was outside it, about to burn the whole thing down. The lake house had always been my father's favorite place. Tucked away in pine-covered hills, quiet and remote, it was where he went to think, to escape, to breathe. Now, it was the place I chose for a meeting neither of them expected. I told them I wanted peace, closure, that I was tired of fighting, ready to let the past go. I kept my tone calm, my words soft. I let my voice tremble just a little. My mother agreed without hesitation. Mason barely glanced at me when he said yes. I arrived hours early. There were no staff that day. No distractions. Just me and the quiet hum of preparation. Cameras, hidden behind light fixtures, inside picture frames, and one tucked under the old record player. Microphones wired into the furniture. Every angle covered. I left a folder on the coffee table. It wasn't labeled. When they arrived, I smiled like a daughter desperate to fix things. We sat in the same room where we used to play board games as kids. I poured tea with a steady hand, asked how they'd been, pretended to forget how they'd buried me. Mason was restless, tapping his fingers, checking his watch. My mother, composed as ever, scanned the room like she was already bored. I started light. You remember Dad's old ledger? I asked. The one he said not to trust on the surface? My mother's eyes twitched. Barely, but I caught it. I kept going. I asked about the trust, the sealed reports. The name of a notary Mason had used years ago. Casual questions, dropped between sips of tea. Then I reached for the remote. I played a recording, just a short one. A conversation I'd pulled from the memorial. A whisper about Cayman transfers. My mother's voice. Clear, controlled, incriminating. Mason stiffened. I pressed further. How did the notary sign when he wasn't even in the country that month? Silence. I played another clip. My mother didn't move. But I saw it. The tightening around her mouth, the shift in her eyes. She knew. They both knew. And this time, I had everything. Their story was cracking, unraveling, in the very house they thought belonged to them. But it was built on ashes, and I was lighting the match. The evidence folder felt heavier than it should have. Not in weight, but in what it carried. I placed it on the detective's desk without a word. The room was quiet, the air tight with questions they hadn't yet asked. I said only what I needed to say. That everything in that folder was real. Verified. Time-stamped. Undeniable. They asked if I had anything to add. I said no. And then I walked out. No second glances. No nerves. Just quiet steps down a tiled hallway that had seen too many liars come and go. This time, the lies weren't mine. It didn't take long. 3 days later, Mason's accounts were locked. Not just frozen, examined. Every wire, every asset, every name connected to him was pulled into the light. Properties halted. Contracts voided. His phone lit up with calls he couldn't answer fast enough. He had always lived like he was untouchable. Now every number he'd hidden behind was dissolving. My mother received a formal subpoena delivered to her door. Financial misconduct, falsified legal documents, and deeper, medical tampering. The sealed report, the autopsy note, the missing tox panel. All of it now part of an active investigation. She didn't respond publicly. She never would. Silence had always been her favorite disguise. But behind that silence now was fear. They thought no one would look. They thought I'd break or walk away. But I watched it all unfold from a distance, calm, still, like watching a storm I had predicted down to the second. There was no satisfaction in it, just certainty. I hadn't imagined any of it. I hadn't overreacted. I had followed every broken thread and stitched together the truth. But it wasn't finished, because it wasn't just about what they'd done. It was about who else let them do it. And I knew there were more signatures, more hands in this, more silence that had been bought and sealed. The storm wasn't over. It had just touched the edge of their world. Now I was moving inward. The building was small. Brick exterior, sun-faded sign, old windows that stuck in their frames when you opened them. No luxury cars in the parking lot. No marble floors inside. Just worn carpet, cluttered desks, and the quiet hum of people working on things that mattered. It was exactly where I wanted to be. My father had funded the place quietly for years, a community legal aid center buried in the footnotes of his public life. He never mentioned it at dinners or events. No plaque, no press. Just quiet support for people with no voice. When I found the paperwork linking him to it, I knew it was the only part of his legacy worth keeping. I didn't take it over for show. I didn't change much. Just cleaned up what needed cleaning, made sure the staff were paid better, fixed the roof that leaked when it rained. And I renamed it, the Halston Center. Not for recognition, just as a correction, so that if anyone asked what my father left behind, this would be the answer. I lived close by. A one-bedroom apartment with old floors and a stove that clicked twice before lighting. I didn't touch the settlement money. Didn't chase the frozen assets now under litigation. I didn't need them. That was the part they never understood. They built their empire thinking power came from ownership, from control. But everything they had tried to control had crumbled the second someone looked too closely. I didn't need their fortune. I had the truth. And I had my name, finally written back into a life they tried to erase. Above my desk, I hung a single frame. Inside it, the page from the will. Ava will receive nothing. The words are underlined in red. Not by anger, not anymore, but as a reminder. A marker of where their story ended, and mine began. People ask sometimes if I'm bitter, if I wish things had gone differently. I tell them no, because if they hadn't cut me out, I never would have learned just how far they'd gone. And I never would have found what was real. Not in money, but in what I chose to build with nothing. What would you have done if your own family erased you from your legacy? Would you fight back or walk away for good? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.